Hey everybody! Welcome to It's Not Scary, It's Just Music. It's me, SJ. Hey, welcome to our episode 0 for season 2 of the It's Not Scary, Just Music podcast. If you followed us in season 1, you might have recalled that episode 0 was essentially me kicking off the podcast itself and telling stories about my history with music, as well as talking a little bit about what we were planning to do for the upcoming episodes in season 1. So, to help kick off season 2, I'm going to refresh our episode 0 and start a little bit from scratch. So, let's get going. First of all, I want to start off by expressing my endless appreciation for everybody that has been listening to the podcast up until this moment. And those that are new to the podcast, welcome to the podcast. We're happy to have you here and joining our community. Before I even started the podcast, I honestly believed that it was really just going to be me talking into the void and having a conversation with perhaps myself or those that are close around me that were entirely sick of me ranting at them about music and this music project that I've been going on for the last several years that is directly tied to this podcast. So I was expecting to get maybe a listen or two a week for each of my episodes. And the fact that I've got over 1,000 listens across platforms and our social media is exploding right now. And the fact that we've gotten a chance to interview some tremendous artists that we've spotlighted in several of our episodes so far has been a really delightful surprise. And it makes me really excited for us moving forward here into the 1990s, where if you thought that the 1980s were busy as far as innovation were concerned, the 90s is going to be like that on overdrive. So it's going to be a really exciting journey for all of us here. Before we get going as well, I just want to call out too that as part of the It's Not Scary Just Music podcast and the music project that I've been going on, I just want to call out that this is all just one person's opinion about all of this music. It's not gospel by any means. I think that in many respects, a lot of my perspectives are not uncommon for avid music listeners. I think that some of my perspectives might be a little controversial, but for the most part, at the end of the day, all of this is just my experience and my reaction to the music that we're listening to as we move through this project and then as we move through this podcast as well. So if for whatever reason, anything that I'm expressing about any of these records, any of these albums, any of these artists that you may agree or disagree with, just know that I'm not right or wrong. It's just one person's perspective on the matter. As well, I interpret and intuit a lot of circumstances around the creation of albums, the creation of trends and movements in music. And some of that might be true, some of it might not be true, some of it might be totally made up in my own crazy mind and it's not actually a reflection of reality. But on the whole, I'd like to believe that after listening to thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of albums and songs across the annals of music history, that I've got at least some semblance of a perspective on where this music is going, how it all threads and connects together. But at the end of the day, like I said, it's just my opinion. Feel free to agree or disagree with it at your leisure. And as well, I get things wrong constantly. So I try to call out where I can if I had a perspective that wasn't correct, or I called out a specific artist or contributor to a band that wasn't actually a part of it or what have you. That happens all the time. I try to call it out where I can in successive episodes, but I miss stuff. I miss stuff every time. But all we can do is just continue to be better as we explore through these years of music history. So, talking a little bit about my experience with music leading up to the 90s. So if you had listened to our first episode 0 before we really kicked off the podcast, you might remember that during my early childhood in the 80s, I was exposed to popular music for the most part, but the opinions and perspectives that I tended to have on music, my preferences, were generally met with criticism or with a strong call to action for me to back up or prove my fandom to particular genres or bands. And so as a result, I shrunk away my overt interest in music and it became more of a private endeavor. And that led essentially into the 90s, where in 1991, starting, I dove very deeply into video game music. And that's essentially what I was listening to for the next almost decade, where I would say around the late 90s, I started to pick my head back up a little bit and start to listen to current music as well as listen to much older music. But for the most part, I was still keeping my head a little bit in the sand and underground because I was afraid of having to defend my preferences and my likes and dislikes. And so I didn't really speak up very much about music. It was a very private thing for me. But in the 90s, I was listening to pop music. I knew a tiny bit about rock of all varieties, so grunge rock, neo psychedelic rock, alternative rock to a certain extent, things like that. And then one of the things that I really enjoyed that I only came to understand in the late 90s was trip hop. And I really, really liked trip hop, but I didn't know very much about it at the time. It took me going through this project in order to learn about its history and its trajectory and how it evolved over time and turned into the variety of things that it did in the 2000s and beyond. So that's a little bit of a history of me and my experience with music. And if you are interested in a deeper dive, you can go back to the original episode 0 before season 1 started and hear all about my trials and tribulations around music listening. So next, I just want to give a little bit of a reminder about this project that I keep talking about that essentially burst this podcast into existence eventually. So several years ago, I decided that I wanted to engage with music in a much more meaningful way, but I didn't really know where to turn. I didn't know where to start. And so I decided I wanted to start with 1980 and listen to every single studio album I could possibly find that came out in those years, because the question that I had in my mind was, how did we get from whatever was happening in 1980 or leaving the 70s decade and getting to things like Green Day and Nirvana? Like, how did that happen? Because I had no idea, because I hadn't listened to enough music up until that point in order to understand those little nuanced changes and trends that led to that moment. So I started with 1980 because of that curiosity. And I did as much research as I could online. This was 2008, 2009, so streaming and cloud and everything didn't exist back then necessarily. So it was really just about me finding the music and accumulating it as best as possible. And then I would listen to all of the albums I could find, good, bad, terrible, amazing, every genre, everything was on the table. And then from there, I endured the arduous task for the first few years before I gave up on it, making mixed CDs, so 20 songs maximum, of the best songs from that individual year. And that's essentially what I was keeping. But like I said, I think I only got through a few years before I realized it was totally impossible to create a list of 20 songs for every year that were the best of the best and have it all run together in a competent and coherent way to make a mixtape. So it was just impossible. So I just started keeping albums. I think I reached 2010. So I went all the way from 1980 to 2010 before I gave up. And then I left it be for several years. And then over the last few years, I picked it back up. And this time I started in 1979 because I knew that I had missed several important albums in 79. And I know that there's stuff that happened earlier than that, and I'm missing a ton. Don't worry. I'll go back. After I get to current day, I will go back to 1950 and go to 78, I promise. It's going to be part of the podcast too, so don't worry. And then leading up to this podcast, I had gotten quite a bit of the way down. I think I'd gotten to 2012 before I decided I was going to start doing this podcast. And the goal of the podcast was essentially to build out a community around people who could engage with and enjoy this music as potentially obsessively as I am and understand the trends that I had been uncovering by listening to hundreds and hundreds of albums every single year and keeping what I liked and getting rid of what I didn't like and seeing how the trends evolved over time. And that's essentially what this podcast has become, going year by year, talking about what I listened to in those years. What am I hearing? What am I detecting and perceiving in the trends of music? What are the essential albums for that given year? And what are my conspicuous absences? The albums in which I was really disappointed to not include it, either because it just didn't match up to the quality of the albums that I did decide were essential, and I hit my limit of essentials because I try to stay to 20 maximum, or it's a really, really popular album that didn't have a place in the essentials because the quality just wasn't there from that perspective either. And then occasionally I'll have check-ins in which we're leading up to incorporating a new, perhaps different genre into the discussion. So I, during the 1980s, did a J-pop, a Japanese popular music check-in for a few years, and then eventually the J-pop albums started to find their way into the essentials when they were up to that level of quality. And so for the 90s, we're going to be doing K-pop check-ins. We're going to be continuing on for a tiny bit our video game music check-in, and then eventually both K-pop and video game music undoubtedly will find its way into the essentials probably very shortly, because the 90s were big for both of those genres. So, as far as the project rules for the 1990s, just as a little bit of a refresh from episode 0 from the last time around, when I'm looking for J pop and K pop albums, I am going through Discogs. That's a website that exists that you can go to and find all sorts of listings. They didn't pay me to use them or to call them out here. It's a really great resource, though, especially for albums that are based in countries other than the United States or Western society. It's been a really great resource for me. The only problem is that you can't delineate or separate out by quality of album, so how many stars it gets, for example. And so in the J-pop and K-pop realms, I'm listening to literally everything, and as a result, I'm having to clear out a lot of stuff that just isn't up to snuff. And what I mean by that is for almost everything else, I'm using allmusic.com. Again, didn't pay me, but it's a really great resource to capture everything else in the world of music. It's got a really excellent advanced search function that allows me to just create these lists and then start to find them in Spotify and build out these playlists for myself to listen through. It's still hundreds of albums that I'm listening to, but it's better than thousands. So for AllMusic, I'm, for the 90s, limiting myself, much like I did for the 80s, to albums that AllMusic rated as 4.5 or 5 stars. And I've actually gone back through, as I had expressed in the first episode 0, that if you start to go down to 4 stars, 3.5 stars, 3 stars, that the amount of albums that you have to listen to shoots up exponentially. And the amount of albums that I keep goes to a teeny tiny little fraction. Like for 5-star albums, I'm keeping probably 50% of them. For 4.5 stars, it's 25%. And then 4 stars, it's like 6%. And then so on and so forth. So I cut myself off at 4.5 to 5 stars for the 1990s and the 1980s just because there was a lot of highly rated albums that absolutely painted that picture for me around what the trends were of the moment. And if I do happen to be missing some highly critical albums that were 4 stars, because usually once they get below 4 stars, they're not really critical, because AllMusic tends to be pretty diligent about not rating highly important or impactful albums, even if the quality isn't totally there, lower than 4 stars, because I think that they at least take into account the impact that an album can have. So it's a really great tool, it's a great metric, and it's what I've been using this entire time. Now, when we get into the 2000s and the 2010s, things do start to change a little bit. So once we get there and we do another episode 0, I'll qualify that. But in this moment, still 4.5 and 5 stars. And then for video game music, I'm using a few different resources in order to make sure that I'm not missing any impactful or important soundtracks. There's a variety of ways that you can look through that. I think that there's a couple in particular. Wikipedia is really helpful in that regard. I think Zophar's Domain, which is a great resource that exists to list out all of the games because it's very community driven, much like Wikipedia. And so it helps me to make sure I don't miss anything. Now, the thing I will say about video game music, about how I'm capturing this music, is it's all on Spotify. And when it comes to J-pop and K-pop, I've only ever missed a small fraction of J-pop and an even tinier fraction of K-pop, because those bands or those producers or whomever are really diligent about putting those albums on Spotify for exposure. And AllMusic is the same thing. I usually get about 99% of the albums that I'm looking for. But for video game music, it's sub 10%, which is really unfortunate. So I try to do what I can for these check-ins for video games, and then also if they happen to make it to the essentials. If Spotify doesn't have it, I'll call it out in the episode and mention, hey, if you actually want to go back and listen to this soundtrack, you might have to go to YouTube if you're really interested in it. Because for the most part, like I said, unless it's a hyper famous game or soundtrack, you're probably not going to see it on Spotify very much. It's unfortunate and it's the limitation, but I'm calling it out here. So just to reiterate about what kinds of music we were looking at in the 1990s. So like I said, it's only LPs. We're not talking about EPs. We're not talking about singles. We're not talking about live albums. And then as far as genres are concerned, no jazz, because jazz tends to be its own experience, its own trajectory, and it doesn't really follow any of the rules of the rest of music trends or genres by nature, because that's the whole thing about jazz. And then also when it comes to world music, it's limited in our listing. Sometimes you'll find it in my big list. Sometimes it will find its way up to the essential list. but for the most part, I'm not keeping it unless it's globally relevant. So if it's more like local traditions, like I said, unless it has global relevance or at least regional relevance, if it's limited to a very specific culture, unless it was an absolutely critical, groundbreaking, or high quality album, I wasn't keeping it. So just as a frame of reference, there's a limited amount of world music, and we're not really engaging with jazz music very much unless, again, it was super relevant to current music trends. So, just a little bit about what I've learned so far. From the last episode 0, I had talked about this idea of a Big Bang analogy. What we said originally was that most ideas or most music trends tend to have some kind of mysterious origin point that will explode in all directions, giving rise to untold amounts of inspiration and creativity for other people to utilize. And there is a directionality to it. There's a beginning, like every single thing in the Big Bang analogy has a beginning, and it spreads out far enough where you can't really see its origins anymore because that material has just proliferated into so many different other solar systems and other planets that it's hard to really detect after a while where the beginning point was. But this decade, I'm actually going to use a little bit more of a meteorological analogy because from last season, a lot of the episode titles that I came upon had to do with storms of various kinds. So this time around, it's going to be more about things like storms and hurricanes. So similar to the Big Bang analogy, everything has a beginning point. There's always a beginning to every single music movement, every single time. Like if we want to talk about from a 90s perspective, Nirvana, Nevermind, right? Obviously, Nevermind wasn't even their first album, so because of that, there was something that came before it. But there were several bands over the course of several years prior that by these little increments created some sound, some idea, some perspective, some way of playing instruments, some way of singing, some phrasing, some lyrical structure that eventually accumulated into this greater storm that became Nirvana's Nevermind. And that storm eventually created other ideas and other storms off of it. But that in and of itself, the idea of it being a storm and having its own period of churning and gaining strength and hitting shore and then losing a little bit of strength as it kind of settles into where it needs to be. And then eventually it kind of peters out in its own life cycle. So what I've found is despite the fact that there are these explosions that tend to happen, there does need to be the right kind of conditions in order for some of these moments to occur. So unlike a Big Bang where, to our best understanding, it happened spontaneously, in this analogy, what we need to take into account too is that it needs to be the right moment and the right ingredients need to be working together in order for these things to happen. So going back to Nevermind by Nirvana, a lot of different things needed to happen in order for Nirvana to accumulate all of the creative ideas and the motivation in order to pull together that album and make it happen. So it didn't happen in a vacuum. There was beginning pieces to it. And much like a hurricane, it needed to be the right temperature. The water needed to be doing exactly what it needed to be doing. The clouds needed to be doing what they needed to do. The gravitational pulls and forces, like all of that stuff needed to be happening in the way that it needed to in order to start churning that storm. And it starts from a little thing, a little idea, and eventually it can gain speed, gain momentum, gain force and power as those conditions continue to be appropriate for its growth and development. So in this case, we're a little bit talking about the underground. So Nirvana being in the underground before they eventually emerged and they did, Smells Like Teen Spirit, and then eventually they exploded onto the scene and changed the face of rock music for the next 15, 20 years. All of that had to start from just this little swirl of energy, and eventually it turned into this big giant thing. So in addition to that, though, much like storms, sometimes the conditions are right, but they never take hold. And sometimes the storms last for a while, and sometimes they are over really quickly. So this is, again, a little bit of a nuance from the Big Bang idea where it just explodes and it's indiscriminate where it's going or how much material there was. In this case, much like hurricanes, sometimes the conditions are right and those hurricanes can be churning in vast oceans, but they never turn into a hurricane. Maybe they just kind of turn into a tropical depression or a tropical storm, but then they don't really go anywhere or do anything. They don't come ashore. They never impact people in any way. It just kind of sits out there and then it peters out, and then that's the end of it, and people don't really realize it. But some of those waves can turn into other waves that inevitably do turn into bigger storms that do find their way here. So it's also possible that some of the music that we're listening to might have been really, really well hidden that were precursors to other things. Like Fang, Landshark is a really great example. I think music files know about Fang and Landshark and how they were a precursor to so much in the world of punk music, and thereafter, like talking about Nirvana and Nevermind, Landshark was a direct connection point to them. And sometimes you'll have these bands that come out with these albums that are happening in this vacuum, and maybe most people don't hear about them, and just a small island of people get impacted by it, and maybe those people go to mainland and say, hey, there's this storm that is coming and you don't even know it, but it's on the way here because it just hit us a little while ago. Or maybe those people just go to mainland to tell a story about this storm that happened. The way that these storms can connect to us can be extraordinarily organic, and it really is dependent on how closely you're watching the world of music. That's really the dependency. And like I said too, some of these storms can last for a really long time. I mean, for all of us that have ever followed a hurricane season or a tropical cyclone season, know that some of these storms can be sitting out for days and days and days and weeks, at a time, and eventually find mainland, or maybe they don't, but they can last for a really long time. And some of these storms kick up real quick, they get super powerful, they impact, and then they're over. And that's much like music too, is sometimes they stick around for a long time and they create incredible impacts, probably on the negative side, but they create, significant impacts for ages and ages and ages. And the stories about those storms can carry on across generations. And sometimes it was a big storm and it happened and then it was over and people forget about it. Or in some cases, it was a big thing that happened and it didn't impact anybody and nobody really talks about it at all. But much like storms, music can change people's lives and we don't always know how. And I think it's a helpful way to think about some of the impacts of these trends in music, just because how they take shape, what their life cycle looks like, and the aftermath of these movements coming through. And one of the other things I'll say about it too is, much like Nevermind or Fang or any of these other bands that we talked about in the previous season, sometimes there can be overlapping impacts. For example, in actual meteorological terms, hurricanes can generate a huge amount of tornadoes at the same time. And so when you have a big enough movement, a big enough storm that creates enough energy, you're going to create all these smaller storms that are inside it, creating all this chaos that's happening. I think Kraftwerk back in the late 70s is a really great example of them ushering in new wave to a certain extent and synth pop to a certain extent too. But all the little storms that were created off of that inspiration are untold. There's countless storms that were created off of this one major wave that was new wave. So that's also a thing that tends to happen, and that can be a genre change, that can be one impactful album, it can be an artist that's leading the charge on a trend for ages and ages. We can't ever really know until it's already kind of happening and we look around and go, wow, this is a really powerful storm. Okay, good to know. And then finally, once the storm actually comes ashore and touches down, it immediately loses strength and starts to dissipate. So when people are feeling that anticipation that something is coming and something is happening, and then that huge wave hits the shore immediately, like that first time you heard "Smells Like Teen Spirit," and you go, wow, this is totally different. This is totally life-changing. This sound is going to change everything. The next time, it'll be a little less so because you're a little bit more used to it. And the next time, it'll be a little less so and a little less so. And it'll just become something that you're comfortable with and used to. And it becomes expected, much like Michael Jackson's Thriller. I'm sure when it first came out, it blew people's minds. And then it's become more just part of the zeitgeist as time has gone on. And so it's a little bit more expected, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's not still important in its moment and the impacts that it made. But the point of this podcast is for us to go back and really analyze and look at some of this music with fresh eyes and fresh ears and say, what was leading up to that moment and what was the impact that cascaded after that? Because a lot of this podcast is music history and figuring out all those connection points. So because of that, though, that dissipation of energy off of these fresh impacts can make us as listeners become a little bit used to or come to expect some of these ideas when you listen to this stuff over and over and over again. And so because of that, it is important for us to go back and really process what we're feeling about this stuff with fresh ears every once in a while. And then the other thing that I'll say beyond this grand meteorological analogy is that the speed of trends, which I talked about in the first episode 0, is something to call out here too as I've been listening, is that these storms can happen really quickly and be over just as quickly. I think one of the fortunate or unfortunate things about this listening project, but then also you all going through this podcast with me, is that we're going to be appreciating and processing and metabolizing trends. And then just as soon as it comes on, we're already saying goodbye to it almost immediately. Like, I think New Wave stuck around for a really long time, but that was only 3-4 years, which was 3-4 episodes. And then we're talking about alternative music, and then eventually we'll leave that behind. We'll talk about Nirvana and get super excited about it for a year or two, and then that'll be over. I think that's one of those things that we all have to acknowledge and understand about this experience and this project, is that the amount of impact that something can hit us in a given year will be profound and significant. And we should really own and appreciate that, but also owning and appreciating the potential grief we might be experiencing because we experienced that huge charge of energy and newness, that experience, and we invested ourselves in it and how awesome it was. And then almost right after that, starting to grieve its ending and moving forward. It's not easy. For me, it's been very difficult from an emotional perspective because I get invested in some of these sounds, some of these ideas. And when I start to hear it become passé in favor of other ideas, and I have to get on board with understanding where these new ideas are going and leaving behind these old ones, it's sad. It's a sad thing. And perhaps you're experiencing that similarly to how I was or how I am. Perhaps you're not. But I want to call out and honor it because it definitely is something very real, and it is potentially challenging for some of us who get really excited and invested in some of this music. And this is to say, too, for the 80s, there was a specific demographic of people that really were committed to enjoying and being excited about 80s music. And we're leaving the 80s behind, right? Season 1 was the 80s, and now this season we're moving into the 90s. And I guarantee you there's going to be a lot of people that are listening to this podcast that are going to be super excited about the 90s, and they're not going to care about the 80s or when we go back and do the 70s or the 60s. It's also possible that they were really, really invested in 90s music and they might have been sticking with the 2000s, but by the 2010s, they've completely lost the plot on popular music. And so we're here as a community to help them. And when I say them, I mean me too. Help us all better understand how these music trends have continued forward and how amazing bands have continued to come out and push the envelope on defining some of these genres, defining what quality music sounds like, and generating these new ideas and challenging us to really continue to expand our threshold of acceptability when it comes to music that we like. So it's really tough. Getting hit with this new idea and this new sound and it being exhilarating and exciting, and then grieving it almost immediately afterward and having to move on and get excited and invest it all over again, and it kind of playing with your emotions like that, that's not easy. But let's do it together. And you know what? If we are finding it hard, let's talk about it. Because I think that that's really important too. Because like I said, this is a community and we're here to support each other as we go through this experience. So as I'm starting to close out here, I want to remind that all of this is my opinion. You know, the meteorological thing about storms and everything, that's all my opinion. What I said in episode 0 the first time around about it being a big bang, it's all my opinion. My opinions about all of these bands and albums, who's making an impact, who's not, who's a conspicuous absence, who's not, who's essential and who's not, all of it's my opinion. It's all my perspective. Like I said, I've listened to thousands of albums at this point, so I'd like to believe I have some kind of pulse on what's of a high quality and what's impactful and meaningful and what's not, but I can be wrong. I've got preferences. I've got biases, 100%. You know, there's no denying that. And further to that, my own understanding and acceptance of newness has and will continue to evolve too. Like when I did this music project the first time around, I hated Nick Cave. I hated him. I hated everything that he did, and I didn't get it at all. But the second time around, after I'd listened to even more music and heard some of the influences that he had created on other bands in the future, I went back and I really understood it and I appreciated it. This is to say, too, this time around, I had a huge bias around hair metal. And over the course of just doing this podcast, I've learned to accept and appreciate hair metal in its own capacity. So I also have my own thresholds for acceptability that are continuing to be challenged and pushed on, even as we're going through this podcast. And I would invite you all to be identifying those things for yourself, too. One thing I'll also say too, though, is listening to thousands and thousands of albums has created in me a certain degree of impatience, which is to say that I know exactly how I want to skip through songs, skip through albums in order to determine if I like it or if they're going in a productive direction. And I've gotten pretty good at it. I think I know exactly where to skip in a song in order to figure out if it's going somewhere at this point. So, because of that, when I'm giving a perspective on music or on an album or a trend or an artist, I'll tell you, at least for the purposes of this podcast, all the things that I'm designating as essential albums, I'm giving them a really thoughtful listen. But prior to that, when I was building my original lists and paring down from Discogs and All Music and the video game soundtracks and everything, I was doing a very cursory listen in order to separate the wheat from the chaff. Because if I didn't do that, I would still be listening to probably 1983 the first time around, because there's just so much to listen to. I mean, we're talking about tens of thousands of hours of music to get through per decade, even. If you had listened to my season finale from season 1, where I listened to approximately 1,500 songs that were already a fairly strong truncation down from where I had started originally and got to 142 songs, it took obsessively listening to those 1,500 songs end to end several times in order to decide how I was going to split hairs there. So it's unfortunate for me that my degree of impatience has gotten challenged as I have to get more definitive and discerning with giving you all the strongest cut of quality for each year. But even still, as I'm going through the current years that I'm listening to, my impatience is quite high. So because of that, I tend to skip intro tracks. I tend to have very specific genres that if I listen to it, I'll give it a fair shake for about 10 seconds if I know that I don't really like it already, and then I'll move on. I'll call out my bias here that like doom metal, death metal, things in that nature, if they're a highly rated album, I'll give them a fair shake and give them a listen. But I already know going in that unless things are substantively changing with the genre, which hasn't over the last 25 or 30 years, I know what I'm getting into almost immediately. So I know where to skip along in order to decide if this is same old, or if we're actually going in new productive directions. So again, the impatience is there, it's real, and I want to call it out as a bias. But like I said, I'm willing to give everything a chance. And having said that too, I'm happy to debate my biases and preferences wherever and whenever, because at this point, I think I'm confident enough in my music listening that if somebody came to me as they did when I was a kid and said, prove your loyalty to this genre, this band, or whatever, or talk about why you don't like it, I think I could probably hold my own at this point, where I think previously I couldn't. So I'm happy to talk about any of those things, and I'm happy to be wrong too. I mean, so much of this too is going in curious and really understanding where those biases are and trying to understand kind of within my body, if I'm feeling something, why? And is it something that I want to keep feeling or not? And then asking myself those thoughtful questions. So I challenge you to do that too. And then a little bit of a refresh on why I'm doing this podcast. So taking all of this into account, this whole music listening project and experience, this was just a way for me to help organize my journey listening to music. Because people ask me, why did you decide that you wanted to do this music project in this way? Because it seems fairly obsessive. And I often reply back that it was honestly the only way that I could think about listening to this music in a way that was satisfying to me, because I'm a huge believer in context. And I just found that if I listened to 60s rock and roll in a vacuum, I wouldn't have understood it and appreciated it as much if I listened to what happened in the 50s or what happened in the 70s, and then so on and so forth. I couldn't tell you, because I'm not at current day, I couldn't tell you, at least as of this recording, I'm not at current day, what's going on in the world of music today other than the super obvious stuff that is apparent to all of us that are not living under a rock. But understanding the connection point between how we got there from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and so forth, how did we get to this point contextually, is critically important to me in my listening experience and my music appreciation journey. So because of that, me doing this podcast not only gives an opportunity for me to help organize all my thoughts together, which it has, but then also allow me to share that journey in a structured, organized way with all of you, because I've figured out a lot of stuff about this music, and I'd like to believe that some of the stuff that I'm telling you all is resonating with you, because we have a lot of listeners, we have a lot of followers, so clearly something I'm saying makes sense to all of you. And I'm really enjoying the fact that we're all building a community around this experience and this journey, so that's also a benefit. And we get to share more of this music with more people. I know a lot of people that are listening to this podcast that are sharing their thoughts and their perspectives on music that they perhaps either didn't have the confidence to speak about thoughtfully before, or they just didn't know enough, and now they feel like they can contribute to music listening conversations with other people that not only helps those people that didn't feel comfortable or confident in their own music opinions, but also people that really, really, really do like talking about music, that are music files, that have been obsessed with music their whole lives. They also have challenges in their own right being able to have thoughtful discussions with other people because their fandom can so eclipse other people's rudimentary or casual listening experience that they themselves don't feel like they have a space that they can share their perspectives to. And so not only are we giving rise to people who didn't know enough or weren't confident enough, but also people that were overly knowledgeable, that gives them a platform in order to share their excitement with more people that might actually kind of know what they're talking about, which is really great stuff too. It generates all sorts of meaningful discussion and debate. So all of that was my hope, goal, desire for this podcast, despite the fact that, like I said, when I first started it, I didn't think anybody would listen to this podcast. So the fact that all of you are listening to it and you are generating those discussions and debates amongst yourselves and spreading the word about all of this music, that's all great stuff. That's the point of all of this. So what can you expect from the podcast? Let's talk a little bit about the structure, because last season we evolved a little bit over time, where we started off with giving you the whole albums in the essential list, and then eventually we started to move towards just giving you some select tracks from the essential albums. We got a lot of really great feedback about that. We started off not having any interviews, and now we are sprinkling interviews in as surprise episodes every once in a while. They tend to come out on Thursdays when we do put them out. One evolution as we're going into this next season is I'm going to talk a little bit less about the trends that are moving in and moving out and what's hot right now, as opposed to what I did in the first season in the 80s, where I was talking extensively about the trends and how they were moving and shifting. Just because as we start to get into the 90s, first of all, the subgenres start to break apart even more so it becomes really, really challenging to keep track of some of these genre trends. But also, genres themselves start to even out and start to flatten a little bit as we get, especially into the late 90s and in the 2000s and so forth, where genres aren't necessarily evaporating or going away. They're just changing very slightly, but they're sticking around pretty significantly. This is opposed to, for example, synth pop or new wave, or before that, roots rock, and before that, rock and roll in its early iterations. Those sounds eventually fall away altogether in replacement of totally new ideas. And as we go into the mid-late 90s and then go into the future, into the 2000s, genres really don't fall out anymore. They just don't. If anything, they actually start to plateau aggressively and start to stagnate considerably. Not necessarily in the 90s, because there's a lot to be done here, but as we get to the 2000s and so on, music trends do start to stagnate aggressively and start to lose their way a little bit. And so talking more about trends isn't going to be super helpful or productive. But having said that, when we talk about all of our essential albums, I will be calling out and discussing contextually what their genre is and how it relates to what came before and what is coming down the pike, not to give away spoilers or anything, but just giving you a sense of where we are in our place in time. I'll still be doing that, but just talking about the trends themselves isn't going to necessarily be productive. So that's basically it. What you can expect from us next, it's going to be our first official episode of season 2. We're going to start with 1990. Much like last season, there's going to be 2 playlists. There's going to be my essential playlist that gives you specific select tracks from my maximum of 20 essential albums for the year. And then also my big list for the year, which is everything that I've kept for that year. So you've got the rest of the essential albums in there. You've got my conspicuous absence albums in there. And then anything else that I decided to keep, it's all in there. And you can go check that at your convenience. And that's about it. Let's go. Let's get going. I'm excited for us to move along here into season 2 and continue to evolve this podcast, because as we had seen in the 1980s, there was a lot of shifting and changing. There was a lot of really aggressive creativity that was coming out of that decade, where we were shifting significantly away from what was happening in the 70s. And as we started to get to the late 80s, we did start to see those little indications that the 90s were coming upon us, even if just as a musical time traveler, as you are, as I am going through this experience, we could hear that the 90s was starting to show up. And the main reason that there was so much creativity happening in the 1980s and will happen even more so in the 1990s, because the 90s is just going to be a huge explosion. It's going to be crazy. The task that I have ahead of isolating down 20 albums every single year is going to be a real challenge for me. But the reason that all of this was happening, all this creativity was happening, is because all of these artists were asking themselves these thoughtful questions about, how do I engage with this music differently? How do I use the tools that exist that have been given to me in the past that have led me to this moment that allows me to better connect with the ideas that are in my head, the feelings that I have in my heart, other people around me, potential listeners, the universe itself. Just, it's all about connecting. And the only way that we can all better connect with each other is to engage with this music fearlessly and with an open mind and an open heart and open ears, because at the end of the day, none of this music is scary. None of it. It might be a little bit challenging, but none of it is scary. It's just music. Thanks for listening, everybody.